special edition of Mainly Unspoken. Today we're going to be talking about the Constitution, and we have Mark Finks back. Welcome, Mark.
Glad to be here, Kelly.
So we're going to be talking about the Constitution again. I know last time you were here we talked about administrative...
representative government and administrative government, the two forms of government that are somewhat mixed together in modern America, a little perplexing to most people.
And today, what are we going to be covering?
Today we're going to talk about the way the Creator, in the words of the founders of this country, is central to the whole theme of our Constitution, the foundation of the whole document. I think people will find that interesting. We'll give them something to think about and many things to decide.
Our founders must have been extremely well-read people to come up with this incredible system that they came up with. How did they decide who would get the power?
Well, they basically studied all the civilizations that they had access to, which included a lot of history. They knew the history of the great empires up to that point in the 1700s, and that included the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, a whole bunch of different ways of governing that had included kings and emperors and many other things. And
so they knew what worked and what didn't work.
They tried to do their best to figure that out. And because the origins of our government were uniquely Judeo-Christian, they applied some very wonderful principles from the Scriptures, the Old and New Testament, which would be to them perhaps the most authoritative works available to them.
So our government is based basically on law from the Bible? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the laws and the spiritual principles. And what we hope to talk about today a little bit, we can't do it justice in this short a segment, but we can give people some things to think about, some questions to answer for themselves. What the founders of this country said in the Declaration of Independence was, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed or invested permanently by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be alienated or taken away. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we've made some reference to these in some of the discussions we've already had. But I think what we should focus on right now is the whole idea of even naming the Creator in such a pivotal, important role in the document. What they're really saying is that there are human beings who live and work on the surface of the earth, and then there's this spiritual power described in the Old and New Testament, referred to as the Creator in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, Elohim, in Hebrew, created the heavens and the earth. And as the ultimate origin of everything, of matter and of life and of people, that gives the Creator God a unique role in our lives. And this is where everybody has to decide for himself what he thinks that is all about. Because there are people out there who are determined atheists who believe there is no God, actually invest emotion trying to resist that idea, and there are people who believe in various kinds of gods who worship, tin idols and all sorts of things. But in the Old and New Testament, the specific statements made and the authority taken there is the authority of the Creator of the universe. I am that I am, the Lord says. And everyone individually has to decide for himself what he thinks of that statement. If there is a Creator God, and He did, in fact, create everything, then He is of ultimate authority about all matters, the beginning and the end of time, since He is timeless. He existed before there was time, and the Scriptures say He'll exist after time has ended, and has the ultimate control over the affairs of the entire universe.
Okay, and according to the Constitution, we got all our unalienable rights from God.
Correct. That's exactly what the document says. The organic law of the United States includes the British common law, the Magna Carta from 1215 at Runnymede in England, and then the Declaration of Independence, and then finally a constitution which constituted what the Declaration declared. We were somewhat deficient with the Articles of Confederation. They were too loosely constructed and too weak to make the government work properly. So we, in desperation, had to have a convention to repair or rewrite. They chose to write a new constitution and get it ratified.
But I think that's a really important a question or something to really think about. Where do our rights come from? They don't come from the government.
Right.
Because our rights existed before the government came along.
Yes, actually, the founders of this country would say that the basic things that they refer to in the Declaration of Independence existed before there were any governments. That man, by virtue of being alive and a created being with a free will, freedom of conscience, had the ability to do those things before there were any governments.
And I think something that confuses a lot of people, too, is just because they didn't list all our rights, and my goodness, there's so many rights. We have incredible rights.
Sure.
That just because it's not listed, that it's not protected by the Constitution.
Right. The principle is that the enumerated rights are specifically named and the unenumerated rights don't have to be named, that they're there also, because all means all.
But how do we prove what they are?
Well, you have to look at what the government claims to do and how many choices individuals potentially at least can have. What we need to teach all citizens, but particularly young people when they're learning about government, is that in a very real way they are masters of their own destiny if they choose to do so. And now today there seems to be a trend, particularly in the government schools, of teaching people to, the young people, to think collectively, to think in groups, to have group exercises in class and have some sort of a group grade on a project where they have 4 or 5 people working together and that kind of thing. It's supposed to teach them cooperation and how to be sociable or some such thing. But in reality, most of the really crucial decisions of life are individual decisions. And if we look at the way the Constitution is set up, it's actually an aggregation of individual people. The preamble of the U.S. Constitution starts out, "We the people," in order to, and it lists the purposes for setting up the Constitution, ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Well, how did the people get the power to do that? The Declaration of Independence says that the Creator endowed them with the people, with the rights and power to do that. And every student, whether an adult or a younger person, has to decide for himself what those words mean. Those are very, very profound words. You first have to decide whether or not you believe there is a God. And if there is a God, is he right? Is he of superior power and authority to any living or dead human? And the scriptures say that he is, but does any individual believe that? He has to decide that for himself, because that's where our ultimate ideas of right and wrong come from in a Judeo-Christian civilization.
So you're saying that people have got to start thinking for themselves. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and thinking the entire process through completely.
So you're saying people just accept government or policy or law without thinking it through, what the consequences are, what their power, who has the authority. So people don't think, is what you're saying.
They're not doing it the way they could or should. And the fascinating thing about the United States of America is that the founders not only came up with this wonderful form of government, the first and only one in the history of the world that we know about. It's been often imitated with kind of near-miss copies since. But at the time that they first wrote the Constitution, they were the first people in the world to ever devise such a perfect system of balanced and separated powers. They didn't think of it as the perfect system in the world. They thought of it as the best system that had been devised up to that time. And I think we would say that in 200 plus years, the document has certainly withstood the test of time. It still exists, and most other national documents are dust in history now. They've not lasted that long.
So getting back to the authority to make government, okay? How today does it still matter whether you think it through, though? Because we the people, we were empowered to have a government by God. We made our government. So is God really part of it, or do we just have to do what the government says now?
Well, that's an excellent question. In the time that we're talking here, this is the year 2002. 2002 what? 2002 AD, Anno Domini, means the year of our Lord. The year of our Lord who? Muhammad, Buddha? No, different years. It was Christ who reset the calendar of the world so that there's a BC, a before Christ, and there's an Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, which means the years numbered from Christ's birth and his life. And it is certainly true that after the initial persecution of the church in Rome, the Emperor Constantine himself claimed to have become a Christian and established the Holy Roman Empire, so that all of the known world of that day, the empire that Rome became in a religious church state, a Christian state, then broke up into the crowned heads of Europe and the individual countries that resulted when the empire broke up. And all of that claimed to base its authority on the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. It's specifically stated in the various documents that refer to the monarchies of England and the other countries. They make specific reference to that. So that was the sovereign power, the king's power, that was taken from King George by our war for independence, and in our case, and given to the people of the United States.
And then we took it and we gave it to the government.
Well, in some sense, yes. I guess we would say that we gave the federal government limited powers. And the deal is a very straightforward deal. The government has the power to do only those things the Constitution allows it to do, and it is not granted powers to do anything else.
But they get a hold of a little phrase of the Constitution and they expand those powers. I mean, the U.S. federal government does not stay within those 20 rights that we've granted them.
No,
I mean, they've gone way beyond.
Today we have wretchedly exceeded it, but we'll get a little ahead of ourselves and outside the scope of our discussion if we go too far in that direction.
Okay.
I think it's enough to say that today we're trying to get people to focus on whether they think there is a creator, and what sort of entity is that? Is it, if there is a creator of the whole universe who knows right from wrong and is what is right, God is light and love and in him is no darkness and so forth, the scriptures say, then what? What do we mortals do with the government that we operate? And the founders of this country were very clear. They did not trust human nature. They said human nature has shown itself to be very depraved throughout history. When you give people more than one of the three functions of initiating, administrating, or judging policy, give them two of those functions or three in the same set of hands, a tyranny results almost immediately. It's just part of human nature
So
to do
God knew that was part of human nature. Is that
well,
what you're
he
saying?
says so.
Okay.
In the scriptures, it's very clear that humanity, apart from a saving knowledge of Christ and a relationship with Christ, accepting the atoning sacrifice of Christ for the sins of humanity, is not capable of doing things that are balanced. They're going to be tyrannical and all sorts of ugly things, because that's the nature of humankind, without a redeemer, without a savior.
So you're saying that the founders, because they studied this, they knew the nature of man.
Yes, they did, and they knew what God said of himself. And it was not a state religion that they talked about. It was a recognition that God had the power and authority ultimately over all of history. They really deeply believed that, and they believed that therefore mankind had to use great wisdom in how it governed itself, because the ugly parts of human nature were going to do a lot of harm if those human traits were not restrained by a written constitution, separated and balanced powers, and a legitimate process, the reference of everything back to voters in some form, electing their representatives and so forth. They came up with a wonderful system that was in fact very practical, as well as very idealistic. It had very noble foundations, but it also had a very good practical sense of what humans did when they were dealing with power and governing other human beings.
So you think today people have gotten away from that, though?
Well, they never learn it.
They never learned it.
They never learn it. We stopped teaching the classic instruction in civics probably 60 or 70 years ago. People get little smatterings in some of their courses. We use topics like social studies and problems of democracy and so forth. And what they wind up studying is a pretty watered down bunch of current events, and there's no bigger picture that shows them the grand design of our government and in effect gets them to go through the exercise that we're talking about of taking the thought of an all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere present creator, which is what the scriptures say of the creator.
And if people understood that, God gave us the power, God understood the what do you call it, man's, what I'm looking for, faults.
He knew, yes, and he knew the entire scope of history from the beginning.
But, okay, he understood. So, and he had us put restraints on the government to have it go back to the people. If people understood that concept, how would it be different today?
Oh, they would take a much more active interest in everything. I haven't the slightest doubt, because in our country, from the period of ratification of the Constitution up till, perhaps well past the turn of the century in 1900, there was a very widespread knowledge of this. People really understood it. Farmers and tradesmen, small businessmen, people from all walks of life were able to read, write, think, and count because of the way our educational system used to work in this country. And they had a keen interest in this wonderful form of government because they had come, many as immigrants and other things from other countries where they were tyrannized by kings or emperors or dictators, and they came to America and they said, wow, this is wonderful. I want to be part of this. I want my children to be part of this and my grandchildren. This is a new way of life, and I want to be an American.
And did they also think that if they were active, they were doing God's work, in a way?
Yes, if they were strong believers as well. If they had a spiritual connection to God, they certainly did believe that, and that was a good thing. The United States was and is, but very notably in the late 1800s, early 1900s, one of the greatest testimonies, the high water mark of religious-based philanthropy in the history of the world. They had mission societies that accomplished all kinds of purposes, relieved the poor and took care of orphans and did all sorts of different things. And that was done as a form of Christian service. It wasn't done because the government demanded money from everybody to accomplish all these social ends. In fact, the people who were doing that 100 years ago would have been very offended if someone suggested that the government should use taxation to force people to pay for these things. They believed that this is what the tithes and offerings that were paid into religious institutions should be accomplishing, and they lived that out. And in fact, if we look at the origin of our country's colleges, universities, hospitals, other charitable institutions, they were uniformly Judeo-Christian in origin.
So people today, they can understand the Constitution, but they don't have to be Christian. They don't have to be Jewish. They can be other belief systems.
It could be anything, as long as they respect the origins of the documents and respect the rights of the other people in society. If you, for example, try to get America to operate an atheist government school system, which has been a recent serious crisis in this country, there are a number of interesting case law precedents now that have made the atheist and anti-Christian elements in government education back off because, in fact, the Constitution does protect people's freedom of conscience, whether they're inside a public school building or not, whether they're a teacher or a student or what they are. And the case law has been pretty uniform in recent years in protecting those rights where people stand up and exercise them.
But what does the Constitution says itself about education or religion in education? In the
It
public
just says
schools?
that the Congress can't make a law respecting establishment of a state religion or prohibiting the free exercise of people's consciences. It's a simple restriction, and it takes care of all of the rest of it with those simple statements. That means the government can't prescribe an official religion, and it cannot interfere with people's exercise of their conscience. It's a very important thing.
So again, what is the most important thing for people to know when they're beginning to understand the Constitution and when they're beginning to study the Constitution? The first concept they have to understand is, where does the power came from to do this Constitution up? And it came from the Creator.
Yes, that's exactly what the founders of this country said.
And we cannot uphold the Constitution if we don't understand that our rights comes from the Creator and not the government. Is that part of it too?
I think that's a good statement of it. And there's this necessity. People need to not only know what you've just stated, but they also have to decide what they think of it. They personally.
When you say what do they have to approve of it, disapprove of it, believe it, not believe it? Why is it important for them to think it through?
Because their whole approach to the rest of the system is going to depend on what they actually believe deep down in their heart.
How would it change? Okay, how would it change whether they believe it or not?
Well, if you deeply respected the origin of somebody else's rights, are you going to damage that person's freedom of conscience, even if you disagree with them? Of course not. That's why people have to think these things through. What we see happening in America today, this business with political correctness, is a tragedy. We are actually trying to pluck the words out of someone's mouth before they utter them. Oh, don't say that. What do you mean, don't say that? You know, I have a right to speak and think too, don't I? Well, of course.
Okay, so one of our rights is to speak and think, all right?
Of course.
And government or society, public pressure, is trying to make people politically correct to make sure you choose the right words and say the right things. And okay.
Well, we're almost getting to be like the Soviets, where the Soviet Constitution in 1976 said you had freedom of belief. You just couldn't publicly express it, that's all. You had to think it inside your own head. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, they talked with various of the Russian people, and they said, well, for 70 years we continued to believe in God, we just didn't say anything because the government kept threatening us that if we did, they'd put us in prison, in the work camp, so we didn't say anything for 70 years.
And you're also saying that people have to start using their own judgment and morals, because if I can say whatever I want, but I shouldn't offend you. I can, what's that old saying, my fist to punch you stops at your nose or something like that? People have to know what's right and wrong.
Your right of self-defense and all stops at the other person's nose. There's got to be a transgression there somewhere. In order for you to defend yourself, the right of self-defense predates governments as well. It goes back to the original creation of humanity, you know, and just you know, that you protect yourself against threats to your life. But that has some very clear legal implications when you put it in the context of our form of government, because it says you can defend yourself when attacked, but you can't aggress against somebody else who's done nothing to harm you, because now you're entering their life and damaging them. So.
Okay, but that's, whether we had a constitution or not, that's a basic right in life. I mean, if you're attacked, you have a right to defend yourself.
Sure.
I mean, that's God's law.
You can find that in the Old Testament and in all sorts of other collateral types of literature. It's a very ancient and accepted idea, and it makes good sense.
And you have a right to say what you want and have a different belief system, and we're taught to be tolerant. Well, maybe Mark thinks this way, and maybe Kelly thinks this way, but you're not going to try to shut me up.
Yeah, our civilization, the United States' history is remarkable in that as imperfect as humans are and as imperfect as governments are, we still achieved an extraordinary degree of freedom for each individual. People of very widely varying religious viewpoints and widely varying cultures were able to come here and adhere to the certain central tenets of our government, agreeing to give other people their rights of free expression and speech and all the rest. And it's amazing what we did accomplish. That is slipping away from us because we're not teaching it. We're teaching something that's more kind of emotional and social. Let's all get together and just be one big happy family. Well, that's a very mushy emotional appeal. It's not going to do the job that carefully teaching the foundations of American government did for prior generations of immigrant people.
And also what it's doing, it's having the government control us, whether during our founders' times we were controlling ourselves.
Right. That's a very important issue. We would say the founders very clearly said, they asked what form of government they had developed in the Constitutional Convention. And Franklin, I guess, I believe, said, well, a republic if you can keep it. And the key concept to keeping this form of government working is that we do have to be self-governing. We do have to have a sense of conscience of our own, informed by some principles of truth, which in our civilization at the beginning were Judeo-Christian, what the Ten Commandments state and certain other things that
Pretty basic. You don't need a government to know what's right. You know
Yes.
it's wrong to kill. You know it's wrong to lie. You know it's wrong to steal.
Sure, dishonor your parents and
And
so
to
forth.
dishonor. I mean, these are just basic things that we all know. We don't need a government. But the government is supposed to protect those rights, even though they're not
yes.
listed. Is that right?
That's what the Declaration of Independence says, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that means an informed electorate consents to be governed by a document which at that time had yet to be written, but the Constitution filled the bill very, very, very well, and we did constitute that statement in law, and it was well respected and well practiced for a very long time. Today, in the era of the me generation, where people are all focused on self and what the self wants and so forth, that doesn't work as well because there's not the same social context of law that the founders intended, and we need to instruct people in that if we're going to be successful at getting them to operate the government again effectively.
We have to start telling the government what to do instead of them having to tell us what to do. Is that?
Sure.
That's what it is.
If we have the sovereign power, which we believe we do, the governing documents say that we do, then we ought to be saying something and doing something. What I always say about a king sitting on a throne and remaining silent. And the American people have the power that King George used to have. We won that in the War for Independence, and we organized it in a systematic fashion with the Constitution. But today, the American people are saying very little. They're not attending elections. They're not informing themselves about candidates and issues. They're not thinking about some of the great underlying principles that should be involved in these decisions. So we're a very weak and a very quiet king.
And is that because they got lost in politics? Because we have these very strong fundamentals that, you know, the country is based on. But now we're all scattered here, there with all these political...
you have alien philosophies. Socialism comes from Europe, basically, and it's an alien philosophy. It's based on atheism. There is no God. So you have no creator. You have no ultimate truth, no ultimate authority. It's just whatever we decide we're going to do. And there's a whole lot of that around. It's in both political parties. You have the fast socialists in the Democrat Party, then you have the slow socialists in the Republican Party. They're all talking socialism instead of the basics of the Constitution.
So most people today then, or that are growing up or born into this era, they don't even know what the fundamentals of the Constitution was because all they know is what the government is doing, which is mostly socialistic.
Right. It's false philanthropy. A real philanthropist is someone who through skill or good fortune or both has been able to accumulate some money, has something to give or some other substance or service. And the government is kind of a counterfeit of that, where it says, give me your money, and then it pretends to be a philanthropist with the money that it's taken from its own people.
We only have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
What do you want people to remember about the Creator and the Constitution?
People need to remember that the founders named the Creator as the source of ultimate authority and ultimate power. It's in our founding documents, it's in the Declaration of Independence, and it's constituted in the government structures and protections of the Constitution of the United States. And people need to think about that.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark, and we hope you come back next week.
I will.
Excellent. Thanks for watching, and remember, you want to start reading the Constitution. You want to start realizing, what are our fundamental rights? Where did they come from? See you next time.